One of the things that for me is really exciting is the number of satellites that are getting launched. There are thousands, tens of thousands of new satellites planned to be launched in the next 5 years. And so with that, we're going to have a wide variety of new data sources and capabilities and insights that are going to be possible, to the point where we'll be able to have daily coverage at very high resolution. We actually can do daily coverage, or close to daily coverage at least, for with optical satellites, and also with some of the SAR, but mostly on the X-band, a daily coverage of what's happening on the ground. And so if we start to extrapolate that and you start thinking about, hey, if satellites are covering my project on a daily basis, I'm going to, at some point, we'll get to where we can identify changes or deforestation happening in near real time.
Welcome back to This Week in Carbon. I'm your host, Eddie Smith. Today we're diving deep into the technology side of carbon markets, specifically how satellite imagery and AI are transforming how we measure, report, and verify carbon projects. Our guest today is Clinton Libbey, founder and managing director of Kumi Analytics. Clinton has spent over 25 years in the satellite imagery space, building systems for companies like Google and Microsoft before founding Kumi to bring geospatial analytics to carbon markets. Clinton, welcome to the show. It's great to have you.
Thanks, Ed. Nice to be here.
Yeah, so first, I think it would be great for the audience maybe just to hear a bit about your background, and hear your story on your experience and how you got into the current work that you're driving at Kumi.
Sure. So I've actually I've been in the remote sensing industry going back to 1992. So it's actually even more, 32 years to be precise. And I initially worked with a small company out of Pasadena, which was a spin-off from JPL, and was very lucky to work with one of the three inventors of digital image processing, Dr. Robert Nathan. He built the first image processing system for NASA for the unmanned spaceflight program in the 50s, late 50s and early 60s. And in spending time with Dr. Nathan, one of the things he would often say is satellite imagery is the richest source of information, but it's very difficult to extract the value out of the data, as it's very complex. And that we wouldn't be able to do that until we had unsupervised classification, which in today's vernacular is deep learning. And during my time with that company, I also worked on the Environmental Intelligence Applications Program, which was a joint program for the Gore-Chernomyrdin Environmental Working Group, where the US and Russia shared classified satellite imagery with each other to look at long-term environmental changes. The Russians were imaging the US was imaging Russia, but we didn't have any data going back to the 60s of our own countries. So we shared data so we could see what it looked like going back to the late 60s, where even before Landsat was available. And this was 1 meter satellite imagery. Fast forward 25 years later, I'm at Google and I started to see unsupervised classification or deep learning happening with satellite imagery, and realized that this is the time to start something. And when you combine those two experiences for the long-term environmental monitoring, as well as the insights from Dr. Nathan and the suggestion that this is when satellite imagery will really will be able to realize the true benefits, I decided to leave Google, which isn't an easy place to leave, but I left and started Kumi with the goal of empowering customers and partners with accurate environmental intelligence information for land, air, and water.
Wow. Yeah, that's quite an amazing background. And I think it was really interesting what you're saying about deep learning. I kind of just want to double click on that. Like you said, when you first kind of saw satellite imagery being used within deep learning, could you kind of expand on that for folks that might not understand? Maybe is this the kind of first stages of artificial intelligence being used on satellite imagery to kind of extract value and important information in different areas?
Yeah, it's actually a tough question to answer because nobody really understands how deep learning works. The one level above that, if you will, or less complex, is machine learning. And so the way that that works is you collect different satellite images, you combine them, co-register them with one another, and then you also collect ground measurements in the field, where they'll say, okay, this plot at this coordinate has X number of trees. Here's the size of the trees. Here are the species of the tree. We then would take that information, combine that with the allometric models to estimate the overall biomass for that particular coordinate. And then we train the satellite imagery with the model to identify these pixel values for this coordinate in the satellite image corresponds to this amount of biomass. And as you do that, you collect a variety of points, and you want to really collect a very diverse set of points so that you understand all the conditions on the ground. And that is then utilized to start to interpret what the pixel values actually represent in terms of biomass. And then there are standard equations to convert that to carbon. So it's teaching the computer what the pixel values mean in terms of biomass, and then we then go from that initial set, what we call the training data set, and then we go into estimation mode where we then apply that training to the entire area. And so that allows us to measure literally every quarter square meter of a project area.
Wow. Yeah, and we're going to get into the market side and then dive a bit deeper into this in a bit. But I just wanted to circle back to your founding story of Kumi, right? So you left Google. I mean, what was it about carbon markets that caught your attention compared to other commodity markets? Because there are great examples of certain hedge fund managers leveraging satellite imagery to make bets on oil supply, etc. So what kind of caught your eye with the carbon markets in particular?
It's a great question. Actually, the funny thing about this is we started off and building some tools to monitor different types of commodities, actually. And given my history, I said I really wanted to have an environmental component to the business. And I initially was just planning on doing that just for the sake of giving back to the planet and helping support the environment. But then there was so much interest in what we were doing in estimating, crops, for example. And I was asked by the Singapore government, can you do what you're doing for corn for carbon and forestry, and in particular for mangroves, because mangroves are very difficult. And so we then started to shift, and we did a full pivot about a year later. We said, okay, there's a lot of interest in the carbon markets. And rather than just having that be a side part of our business, which was more for helping the planet, to make that the focus. And there were a series of scandals and problems where, what was happening, if you go back to my machine learning example, what was happening is people were just sampling the very dense areas and then extrapolating those values across the entire project area. And this resulted in significantly overcrediting of the overall biomass for the project area. And so we then introduced a stratified sampling method that allows you to look at both low density areas, high density areas, and everything in between. And so that way you get a better overall understanding of everything in the project area. And so that was really our main goal, was to provide higher integrity and transparency, publish everything, make all of the data available so that anyone can review that and get a better understanding of the actual status of the project.
Yeah, wow. So it kind of came, this idea and opportunity kind of came out of this downfall of this integrity scandal on a certain projects in the market, and not a lot of folks were able to see that issue, right? Which is why it happened, right? The overcrediting. So that's very interesting from a historical context to know. But I think for many people in the carbon market, satellite imagery is like a black box. Like they know it exists and that it's getting better, and we've got all this great technology now, but they don't really understand the differences between satellite types. I mean, what they can actually measure, um, and how those capabilities kind of vary by ecosystem, right? Because carbon projects are so diverse. You mentioned blue carbon, mangrove restoration, and Singapore is heavily focused on carbon sequestration projects. But in other areas, I mean, there's projects across hundreds of different areas. So it's very interesting, and I think this is a good chance to educate the audience on maybe some fundamentals on, what are the main types of satellites used for environmental monitoring, and what are their strengths and limitations. Maybe how has the technology evolved over the past decade? 'Cause that's a long-winded question, but yeah.
Sure. So there are really a few types of satellites. The first one being optical, which is very similar to the way that our eyes see, where we can see different colors. The satellites typically have more what we call bands, which is slices of the spectrum that we are able to see. And so if you think about that's one element, is how healthy is the forest. You and I could go into a restaurant, and I look at a plant and I say, oh, that plant needs to be watered. And you look at it and you say, well, actually, it looks more like it needs fertilizer. And someone else looks at it and says, no, there's a pest infestation. The botanist may do that. And we can see that inherently with our eyes, but it's, sometimes there are even more subtle things, like earlier in the stage of perhaps it needing water, there's a slight variation in the color that we can't really see, but the satellites can. So that's the optical side of things, where it's looking at the vegetation and the health of the vegetation. Likewise, with the optical satellites, you have a range of resolutions. So you have each pixel, or each dot on the screen, so to speak, represents it's a 30-meter resolution, for example, with Landsat. So every dot on the screen represents 900 square meters. And then you have the Sentinel satellite, Sentinel-2, and that's a 10-meter satellite. So each dot on the screen represents 100 square meters. So it's 10 by 10, 100. There's also very high resolution satellites, like say a Worldview from Vantor, and that satellite has a 2-meter and half-meter or 30-centimeter resolution. So each dot on the screen now all of a sudden represents less than a meter in size, right? So the half-meter is a quarter square meter per pixel. And once you start getting to that resolution, you can start to see individual trees and identify that. So that's the optical side. When we look at SAR, it's very different, and that is SAR. The way SAR satellites work is they send out an energy pulse, and based on the way that bounces back, it provides information as to what's on the ground. And you have different frequencies of SAR. So there's X band. So I like to use the example. Let's say I'm a tree. X band will hit the top of my head and then bounce back at the top of the tree, at the crown of the tree. It'll bounce back and I can get information on the crown. C band, which is a bigger wavelength, it penetrates, it goes around my head, if you will, and will get my arms and the branches. L band is even a bigger wavelength, so it goes around those branches and it is able to see the trunk of the tree and the ground. And then P band is even a larger wavelength, and it can see the full spectrum. So what happens is if you think about if you have a laser pointer and you point the laser pointer, it's a very, very tight bandwidth. The first leaf that it hits, it reflects back and it doesn't go any further. But if you have a walkie-talkie and someone's hiding in the bushes, you can communicate with them because it's a much bigger wavelength and it goes around the branches and comes back and provides a signal back. So when we start looking at SAR data, it gives us information on the density of the underbrush. And that's where you get additional value above and beyond the optical color of the vegetation and the health of the vegetation. Now you start to see the density under the canopy. There's also shortwave infrared, which is another type of satellite, where that's where you're able to see emissions in the air. So let's say there's a refinery or a gas leak in a pipeline. It can see the air, the molecules in the air, if you will, and it is able to identify that signal, and it picks that up. And then you have LiDAR. Now, there aren't many LiDAR satellites. It's more of an airborne platform. And that's where it's sending out, it's sort of a combination in many ways, but it's sending out pulses and gets that information back, and it's very dense for airborne LiDAR. And that really gives you a good understanding of the canopy. But once again, most LiDAR systems don't go down to the ground unless it's a sparse forest. And that's where it's not ideal for something like mangroves, because a lot of the biomass is below the canopy, and it's the underbrush and the density of the underbrush that drives the carbon stock.
Yeah, and you kind of touched on it already, but obviously different types of satellite-based carbon monitoring they differ across ecosystems, right? So what works well for tropical forests might not work for mangroves or grasslands. Can you maybe walk us through the variations and what carbon project developers kind of need to understand about the trade-offs between ecosystems and what technologies work best?
Sure. So when working with satellite imagery, one of the key things to keep in mind is the concept of data fusion, and that's where you're combining multiple satellite types together, or different satellite sensors, in order to take advantage of the benefits or the strengths of each. And so data fusion as being the key thing from the very beginning is something I'd like all the listeners to keep in mind, because what we can do is we can combine the satellite images, and we identify the components of each of the satellite or data types and leverage those strengths so that we get a better overall understanding. When working with a tropical forest, for example, one of the main determinants of the amount of biomass in a tropical forest is the height of the trees. And that's where LiDAR is very useful, and it's very helpful in terms of understanding how high the tree is. You can get very precise, accurate measurements with LiDAR in terms of the height of the tree versus the ground. So what's the total height? And that's going to drive the biomass estimates. In mangroves, it's different, because mangroves tend to not be that tall. I mean, some species will grow tall, but a lot don't, and they just grow maybe 5 meters tall, and that's it, but it's very dense. And so there you want to get an understanding of what's below the canopy. How dense is it underneath? How many branches are there inside? How close are all the branches underneath versus just the canopy and seeing the top? And that's one of the big differentiators in terms of those two. And grasslands also is similar in that regard, where you're looking at a broad area. It's not anywhere near as complex as mangroves, right? So, but you want to see the density, and you're gonna leverage more on the optical side for grasslands than you will with the SAR, but still gives you that density information. And so you want to always combine the sensors, and the more the data sets that you combine and leverage the strengths of each, the better your overall assessment's going to be. If you go back to my example with the tree, of me being a tree and having the different SAR sensors, if I start combining all of those, I have a good understanding of both the canopy cover, the top, all the way down to the ground, and the density and the different layers. And the more information I have like that, the better my overall estimate will be.
Yeah, it's really fascinating stuff, and I think I want to get into blue carbon and mangrove restoration, because we've kind of talked about it briefly. But first, I want to ask about the blue carbon work that you're doing with the Singaporean government, right? Because that's really interesting. So, like, why did they ask you to focus on blue carbon and not other types of projects? Is this correlated to developing their own carbon projects that you're kind of assisting with on their mangrove sites, or is it just for research purposes, etc.? Like, how did this opportunity with the Singaporean government come about, right? And why specifically mangroves for Singapore?
So why specifically mangroves is a good question. There's a significant amount of carbon stock in the region, and Southeast Asia in particular has one of the largest carbon stocks tied to mangroves. Mangroves also are being deforested. 50% of the mangroves in the region have been wiped out. Also, very difficult projects to run. They
Now,
have a very high,
sorry,
high.
I don't mean to cut you off, but what's the reason like these mangroves are being wiped out? Is it more from erosion or is it human induced? Like they're kind of using it for maybe different purposes, clearing the land. Um, just curious. Just
Sure.
curious there
So
on
there are
why.
two. I mean, from what we've seen in our analyses, is that there are two main drivers of that. One is agriculture, in particular palm plantations. So palm grows in the same ecosystem as mangroves. So they don't grow further north. So it's a tropical, and there's a huge demand for palm oil around the world.
Mm,
Right. This is one of the big drivers that we've seen. Also, aquaculture. So we see a lot of aquaculture, whether it's shrimp farms, also a similar type scenario where shrimp farms perform very well in those flooded areas, which is where mangroves also thrive. So
mm,
between aquaculture and palm plantations, that's been some of the major drivers of mangrove deforestation.
yeah, yeah. Thanks for clarifying. Didn't.
No worries. And so the Singapore government basically had, during the pandemic, they had an initiative called Emerging Stronger Together, where they wanted to demonstrate, they wanted Singapore to be a leader in green finance. And so, as part of that, they asked if we could develop a methodology and a proof of concept to demonstrate how we can measure biomass using a satellite imagery, and in order to scale that and be able to do it more efficiently. And so that was the initial impetus. And Singapore takes climate change very seriously as a country, as an island state. It's very it's at risk when it comes to sea level rise, and they've got 2050 commitments to be carbon neutral. And if you look at the activities that they're doing with other countries in Article 6 transfers, they're establishing the relationships around the world in order to achieve that carbon neutrality. Singapore government also has a series of initiatives. Actually, just yesterday, announced initiatives for blue carbon to help improve the ecosystem and identify new ways to leverage satellite imagery. So there's the Office of Space Technology and Industry, which is part of the Economic Development Board, is creating programs to identify new ways to measure blue carbon, as well as the Ministry of Trade and Industry also is establishing incentives and recently created a partnership and an announcement yesterday actually with WWF as well as with Hatch Blue on creating new solutions for blue carbon. So they view blue carbon as a very key underutilized asset, if you will, in the carbon markets. It's a very small percentage of the overall carbon markets, but it's actually very impactful when it comes to carbon sequestration.
Yeah, yeah. I was just about to touch on the market side because I think it's just really interesting. Kind of, we're in different parts of the value chain in the carbon markets, and coming together, having a discussion about it just puts things in perspective, right? So, from my seat, well, what we're seeing at Valterra is blue carbon credit prices are hitting 15-month highs in 2025. There's very limited supply. I mean, you really can't get any in the spot market. Most of the deals being done are being structured on the forward curve, long-term offtakes going into the 2030s. There's been fewer than I think 10 million tons of blue carbon credits issued annually per year versus the hundreds of millions that are needed, right? We're seeing standards like Gold Standard and Vera, coming up and releasing new mangrove methodologies. So there's clearly a ton of underlying demand for blue carbon projects and blue carbon credits from corporates, whether that be in the shipping sector or other sectors of the economy. They love blue carbon. So The question is, why aren't we seeing more supply to meet the demand? Right? I think this has something to do with the difficulty of the projects, right? And that's where kind of Kumi Analytics comes into play.
Yeah, so there are a series of challenges. One is it's very difficult to walk through a mangrove forest, as an example, and to really do and get a good understanding. It's incredibly dense, and so it's hard to actually get the samples in the field. And so we've built some tools to help facilitate that. But in general, it's inaccessible in many ways to get deep into a mangrove forest. So that's one thing. Secondly, it's very dangerous. There's a lot of vipers and different threatening species there for the field crews to get in there. So there was a safety component also in that. But that's also tied to its incredible biodiversity, right? So there's huge benefits in terms of the fisheries and biodiversity with mangroves. So while it may be dangerous, it's also, that's part of the allure, and the benefit of that is the providing a healthy environment and for different species, as well as cleaning the water. I mean, there's so many benefits with mangroves: coastal protection from large storms, and so on and so forth. But the other thing, it's very difficult because what mangroves need water to come in and out, but they don't like standing water, and they don't like to be dry. So when you're planting, a lot of these considerations need to be taken into account, where I want to make sure that there's sufficient water flow in and out of the mangrove area, but not having it stand still. And this requires some hydrological studies, as well as understanding the detailed elevations and the tidal ranges, and a variety of additional factors, which when you go to do a project, if you don't incorporate these factors, you end up having a very high mortality rate. So we've seen projects go from anywhere from 10% mortality rate, which is incredibly good, all the way up to 80 and even 90% of the plantings die. So they just don't survive. And when you consider someone's planting tens of millions of mangroves and they cost about $1 each, and depending upon where you are in the world, but about $1 to plant it, if 90% of those die, it's very hard to have a successful project. And so that's one of the challenges. And I believe that the use of remote sensing data and geospatial analysis in general is going to help that dramatically. And to identify where the planting zones are, where should we plant, where shouldn't we plant, and to be able to take advantage of that data. And so I think we'll start to see higher success rates as these technologies are being adopted.
Yeah, it really resonates what you said about the seedlings, right? $1 per seedling, 90% of them die. And you have a bankrupt startup carbon project. So yeah, I mean that answers the question right there about supply concerns, right? And why demand outpaces supply for high quality blue carbon projects. But another point I wanted to touch on is the soil carbon, right? So soil carbon is a huge component of blue carbon stocks. But satellites can't see underground, and you mentioned how it's very difficult for humans to kind of get in the field at a blue carbon site. So how do you model or estimate below ground carbon for mangrove sequestration?
Okay, so there are a couple components in any project. There's the above ground biomass, which is what we were talking about before, and seeing all the biomass above, and measuring the density of the forest and the crown of the forest, the canopy. And then there's below ground carbon, which is typically tied to allometric models, which estimate based on the size of the tree and the diameter at breast height, what's the root system look like. And that's fairly well known. They've basically, what they do is they'll dig up a mangrove, including all of the roots and everything, burn the whole thing, and then take the ashes and weigh the ashes, and that'll give you the overall carbon content of the entire tree. It's sort of crazy, cutting down the trees in order or digging them up even to see the amount of
Burning
carbon.
them.
Yeah, and then burning it.
Does that
But
go
this
into the project's rating? No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, this is the way that you have to do it. And if you think, for
Yeah.
those of the audience that don't understand what an allometric model is, we've all seen Da Vinci's drawing of the human body, and you extend your arms, and the from fingertip to fingertip is your height, right? And so you can take a measurement of your wrist and your thigh and your height, and you can pretty much tell how big, what the biomass is of a person. It's the same thing with trees. It's the same thing with insects. There's allometric models for everything. And so with the trees, though, they also incorporate the below ground biomass. And so there are equations. They are referred to as root to shoot ratios. And you can determine how much below ground biomass there is as part of the mangrove. And then from there, there's the soil. And the soil organic carbon, soil carbon saturation is basically how much carbon is actually in that first meter, if you will, of the ground where you're protecting that area. And that is a big part of the project. And right now, while there are some methods to estimate soil carbon for agricultural fields, you don't have the heavy canopy that you've got with blue carbon or mangroves. And
Yeah.
and so you
This
need
comes
to.
back to what you were saying about lidar technology, right? And just kind of thinking out loud, like if lidar alone isn't sufficient for mangrove restoration, what combination of technologies works better for mangroves then, right? Or I guess, what is Kumi's approach to kind of mangrove restoration project? It's a better
So
question.
we combine SAR data with optical as what we found has the best results and is the most scalable and cost effective. One of the things, in all of this is it needs to make sense financially, and it needs to have high integrity. And so how do you balance that, and in terms of the data sets that are chosen? And with soil, though, for just to getting back to that part, is that with mangroves you need to do core samples. There are some, you can leverage P band or L band, and it does penetrate the soil, depending upon the moisture level, because water absorbs SAR as does carbon. So you need to disambiguate the water content from the soil, and it's very difficult to do that in a mangrove ecosystem because it's often flooded, and the SAR won't penetrate water. So it's just gonna, if it's moist, it'll go down a little bit, but if it's not moist, if it's very dry, L band or P band SAR will go several meters into the ground. But if it's wet, it just hits the water, and if it's flooded, it just hits the water and bounces right back out. So it's not, you can't use that technology, unfortunately, for the mangroves. If you look at seagrass, on the other hand, it's also an interesting part of the blue carbon ecosystem, and we're working with the National University of Singapore, as well as several other agencies, the Philippine Space Agency, the Maldives Space Research Organization, to measure seagrass density, leveraging optical data. And this is one of the things where you need to correct for the distortion from the water, and then you can start to identify how much seagrass is there, because you create what NDVI, which a lot of people may have heard of. It's a normalized difference vegetation index, and it gives you the health and density of the vegetation. And so once you correct for what's called a water column corrected NDVI, you can then see how much vegetation is on the ocean floor, within a certain depth limitation, for seagrass mapping. And so that's one of the things that we're working on right now, to expand our solutions, not just for mangroves, but also to accommodate for seagrass and seaweed, actually.
Yeah, and touching on like some of the work that you're doing now, outside of just with the Singaporean government, are you also doing work for like, private carbon project developers in the mangroves space?
Yes, yeah, we do. We have several projects underway currently, several in Indonesia and Malaysia, and we're working on some others in the region as well, to expand this, out out further. And one of the things that we did is we actually established a partnership with the University of Oxford, Oxford University, and we developed a methodology for mangrove mapping. And in developing a methodology, one of the things that you're sort of obliged to do, if you will, is a wide variety of other types of analyses. So land cover mapping, land cover change analysis, biomass estimations, forest density models, identification of different species coming in or invasive species, and identifying all of the attributes of a project and how to account for all of that. Really forced us to build a wide variety of technologies that we're finding other scenarios in other parts of the world where they need detailed land cover mapping to track deforestation. So while we're active in the carbon markets, we also are actively working with other organizations for just monitoring the environmental situation on the ground and how that's changing, and not particularly tied to carbon offsets, but more for environmental monitoring.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it seems like the state of global kind of environmental science technology is advancing and evolving very fast, and it has done so the past 2 decades, and will continue to do so with the advanced machine learning and AI capabilities that we're seeing. And I want to get into the future of digital MRV and within the carbon markets. As our audience might not be aware, digital MRV is one of the most important tools in carbon markets, and Vera has launched a digital MRV initiative. Gold Standard is piloting satellite verified projects. The ICVCM, the core carbon principles emphasize transparency and data quality. So I just think I would love to get your opinions and or viewpoint on, given your background and history in the space, like where are we today that maybe, or like where were we 10, 20 years ago compared to today? And then where do you think we'll be in 5 years, in 10 years, with the type of technologies that you're working on and working with?
That's it's a tough one. I wish I could forecast it accurately, because when you think about the fact that ChatGPT has only been around for 3 years, and how that's changed so many different things. And all of the Gen AI tools in terms of all of that, it's just only been around for a couple of years, and it's accelerating. One of the things that for me is really exciting is the number of satellites that are getting launched. There are tens of thousands of new satellites planned to be launched in the next 5 years. And so with that, we're going to have a wide variety of new data sources and capabilities and insights that are going to be possible, to the point where we'll be able to have daily coverage at very high resolution. We actually can do daily coverage, or close to daily coverage at least, with optical satellites, and also with some of the SAR, but mostly on the X-band, a daily coverage of what's happening on the ground. And so if we start to extrapolate that, and you start thinking about, hey, if satellites are covering my project on a daily basis, I'm going to, at some point, we'll get to where we can identify changes or deforestation happening in near real time. And I think if we look out 5 years from now or 10 years from now, I think we'll definitely be at that level, at a very high resolution as well, which is important, because when we start thinking about deforestation, in particular for mangroves as an ecosystem, it tends to be very slow and then all at once. So what happens is, people will take 1 or 2 trees and they'll use it for firewood, and every day they're cutting down 1 or 2 trees. And the satellites like Sentinel, which are 10-meter resolution, or each pixel representing 100 square meters, as mentioned before, I don't see the 1 tree disappearing. But with very high resolution, I will, right? So I'll start to see slowly the slow degradation of the mangrove forest. And what happens is, as they're cutting down 1 or 2 trees every day or every week, over time, it gets to a certain point where it starts to impact that water flow that we were discussing earlier. And then all of a sudden the water is stagnant or it's not flowing properly, and then the entire system fails. And so that's why I'm saying it starts slowly and then all at once. And so degradation is one of the biggest challenges with mangroves. And it's also one of the biggest challenges in a lot of DMRV systems, because most of them use the low resolution or mid-range resolution data that's free, rather than going for the premium data sets that are at the very high resolution. And that's one of the things that we work with both, right? And so if a project developer wants to get the high resolution data sets, we incorporate that, and we can incorporate that on a regular basis or based on different frequencies of their monitoring.
Yeah, and one of the biggest challenges in the voluntary carbon market is just the fragmented and kind of opaque nature of the data and the lack of kind of data standardization. So when you think about digital MRV frameworks, how do you think about interoperability and standardization amongst within the voluntary carbon market for digital MRV kind of frameworks, right? Because we're seeing these things kind of all happen in real time with regards to developing the frameworks. But you think there could be a point where there's much more interoperability and standardization of the data that we're getting from these projects?
Yeah, standards are a double-edged sword in many ways, because they stop innovation, but they also allow for interoperability and sharing of data. So I think standards need to be principle-based in many ways, and to leverage the latest technology, and so that they can evolve over time. At the same time, they need to have standard outputs that can be incorporated into other systems. So, for example, we're looking at the CDOP, the Carbon Data Open Protocol, as a way to export the results so that they can be integrated into other systems. And those types of standards are really good. But if we establish a standard saying everyone has to use one satellite to measure the carbon, then when a new satellite comes out that does a better job, it's like, well, we can't use that because it's not approved by the standard. And so standards need to be flexible in their approach of data sets, so that you have the flexibility to use the latest and greatest technologies, but have an established or consistent output that allows me to share that data with other infrastructures or other tool sets, so that they can also interpret that data. So it's there are good things about standards and there are bad things about standards, and we have to be careful with the standards so that they actually embrace innovation rather than inhibit it. And I think that's one of the things that we've seen in the market, is that some of the standards were developed 20 years ago, and so they weren't taking advantage of these new tools. And now they're starting to adopt them, or say, hey, we need to leverage satellite data because of scandals. So how do we create standards or approaches in the market that allow us to evolve and leverage new data sets? At the very least, have the standards such that it's flexible enough so that it can accept new data sets based on some type of validation approach, rather than limiting it to a certain data set. And that's where I think you will start to see more, to your earlier question about where things will go, we'll start to see more of that, where there's going to be an adoption and an openness to new data sets. So say, for example, with Vera, there's a requirement for 30-meter data, right? So it has to be a 30-meter pixel or better. That doesn't mean that you can't use very high-resolution data. Or with Ox Carbon, they say use the latest and greatest technology and provide a justification. So, we have, and Gold Standard also is saying, okay, minimum of 30 meters, but if you want to use something better, great. And for certain aspects, they say, okay, it needs to be 10 meters or better, right? So I think or better, it needs to become a standard component of all of the standards. And then, you look at the ratings agencies, and they will use very high resolution data. So a lot of projects, the project developers, they say they want to use the free data, and so they use 30-meter data or 10-meter data. And then the ratings agencies use half-meter data or 30-centimeter data to evaluate the project. And so you have this conflict where I'm rating you and I'm going to use much higher, much more accurate data sets than you need to get approved by the standard. And so as a result, they suffer from ratings downgrades or from a low rating, because when you use the very high resolution data, you can see that degradation, whereas you couldn't see it with the medium to low resolution data sets that are required by the standard. So I think project developers and high value projects in particular are going to continue to move more towards higher resolution data sets. They're going to need to validate the accuracy and demonstrate a higher level of integrity through the use of higher quality data sets. And what we've seen in the market is this directly is tied to increased values. So if you get a good rating, from one of the ratings agencies, you have a higher value in the market. And your product, actually, the offsets capture a higher price. So spending the money on the high quality data is very justifiable if you can increase the value of your offsets by $3 to $5 per ton.
Yeah, very, very well said and articulated. Thank you so much. And I think this has been a masterclass in what satellite technology can and can't do for carbon markets. And I really thank you for sharing your perspective and experience with our listeners, right? And to our audience, if you enjoyed this episode, subscribe, leave a review, and share it with colleagues who are interested in carbon markets. But we'll be back next week. Until then, thank you.
All right. Thanks, Ed. I appreciate it.